Chapter 1. The Impossible Crime. It was on a rain-polished morning in late October, when the grey fog clung low upon Baker Street and the clatter of hooves upon wet stone echoed like an unsettled conscience, that the most singular case of my long association with Mr. Sherlock Holmes began. The case, I dare say, rivaled even that of the speckled band in its sheer bizarreness, for it concerned a photograph that, by all appearances, exhibited signs of life. Holmes had risen earlier than usual, a sign either of boredom or anticipation. I found him at the breakfast table, the remains of toast untouched, a pipe resting cold beside his plate, and a thin envelope resting on the linen like an omen. He made no motion as I entered, only raised his sharp eyes from a scrap of paper he was examining through a magnifying glass. "Watson," he said without preamble, "have you ever known a photograph to throb?" I blinked at him, momentarily wondering whether the fog had addled my senses. "I beg your pardon, Holmes." He laid the paper aside and tapped the envelope. "This arrived an hour ago by private courier. No return address. Inside was this." He reached for the contents, withdrawing a single photographic print, sepia-toned, perhaps 10 years old at most. It depicted a man seated stiffly on a garden bench. The composition was ordinary. And yet, "Good Lord," I muttered, for as the light from the gas lamp struck the image, the man's chest, a shadowed region just beneath his left lapel, seemed to flicker. It was no more than a tremor, a distortion of the emulsion perhaps, yet it pulsed like a heartbeat. Holmes was watching me closely. "You saw it too?" "Yes." "But how is that possible? It's a photograph, Holmes." "Just so, but observe. No maker's mark, no studio stamp, no developer's signature. It is as though it emerged from nowhere." He laid the photograph flat and leaned back, tenting his fingers. "There's something else. The man in the image, do you recognize him?" I studied the face. It was long and hawkish, the nose aquiline, the eyes set deep under a heavy brow. "He looks vaguely familiar, but I cannot place him." Holmes nodded. "Colonel Julius Addleton, decorated twice during the Sudan campaign, retired, unmarried, and—" He paused dramatically. "Pronounced dead 12 days ago." I started. Dead, but then, this must be an old photograph. Indeed. And yet the photograph was taken, at most, a week ago. The leaves in the background matched those of the early October season. "See the reddened tips of the ivy? That's not last year's decay. That's this autumn's fire." A silence fell, broken only by the faint tap of the rain at the window. Holmes spoke again, quieter this time. The photograph was accompanied by a single line written in careful, serifed script. "Find the pulse, and you'll find the murderer." I looked again at the image. The man's face was expressionless, but the pulse, if it could be called that, still beat faintly, like a phantom heartbeat caught in chemical haze. "This is either a macabre hoax," I said, "or something beyond our understanding." Holmes rose abruptly and turned toward the window. "It is neither. It is a challenge, and we shall accept it." There was a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with a faint frown, carrying a small black envelope. "Another message for you, Mr. Holmes." The gentleman insisted it was urgent, wouldn't leave his name. Holmes took the envelope without a word and sliced it open with a flick of his thumbnail. Inside was a card. He read it silently, then handed it to me. It read, "He will be buried tomorrow at St. James Cemetery. Watch the coffin." I looked up, but Holmes was already shrugging into his coat. "Come, Watson. The game has begun, before the man is even in the ground." And with that, we stepped into the swirling fog of Baker Street, unaware that we were descending not merely into a murder investigation, but into a puzzle that would twist memory, mortality, and the very meaning of the still image. Chapter 2. The Whisper Beneath the Soil. The next morning I found us standing upon the damp, hollow grounds of St. James Cemetery, the sky overhead a pewter sheet threatening rain. The tall yews cast jagged shadows over the wet grass, and the scent of turned earth clung heavily in the air. Holmes stood motionless beside me, his collar upturned, hands deep in his coat pockets, eyes fixed upon the modest gathering ahead, a burial party, quiet and efficient. The clergyman's voice murmured through the mist, reciting the standard liturgy. Before us lay the dark mahogany casket of Colonel Julius Addleton, suspended over the open grave by two thick canvas straps. Beside it stood 3 men and a woman, presumably relations or close acquaintances. None we recognized. It is, as the Americans say, a closed casket affair, Holmes murmured. And you were hoping otherwise? I was hoping for inconsistencies. We must content ourselves with reactions. The woman dabbed her eyes with a lace kerchief, though her tears seemed practiced. One of the men, broad-shouldered and stiff in bearing, stood apart, staring not at the coffin, but into the middle distance, his face unreadable. Holmes followed his gaze. "Watson," he said quietly. "Observe the man on the left. Ex-military, wouldn't you say?" "Yes, his stance suggests it." "Indeed. And notice how he flinches. Not at the mention of the colonel's name, but at the word departed. That man is either haunted or hiding." "Surely grief is unpredictable," I said. Holmes made a sound like the click of a pocket watch snapping shut. "Grief is unpredictable in form, not in pattern. That man did not mourn. He tensed." A low creak of straps drew our attention as the coffin was lowered into the earth. At that moment, something peculiar occurred. The third man, short, balding, with the posture of a man unaccustomed to the outdoors, staggered backward, clapping a hand over his mouth. His face was drained of color. Holmes stepped forward slightly, eyes narrowing. "Did you see that, Watson?" I nodded. A sudden faintness, but why? Holmes drew his watch. Note the time. 11:31. We must ask what occurred precisely then. As the grave diggers began covering the coffin, Holmes turned and began walking away from the service without another word. I followed him, puzzled. "Holmes, where are we going? Surely we should speak to them, gather names, question their relationships to the deceased. And we shall in time. But not here. Not now. Here, we are outsiders. The dead hold sway. We must wait until they've relinquished their hold." He turned onto the cemetery path and walked briskly toward the gates. Back in our sitting room at Baker Street, the photograph lay once again on the table, now under Holmes's magnifying lens. He had removed his coat and was cross-referencing a large botanical atlas open on the floor beside him. "Watson," he said without looking up, "fetch me the Army Register from the shelf by the hearth, the volume with the green spine." I complied, handing him the thick tome. He flipped through it until he stopped on a page near the center. "Colonel Julius Addleton, commissioned in 1876, attached to the 19th Hussars. Fought at Abu Klea, later stationed in Lahore." "None of which explains a living photograph," I reminded him. "Ah, but we are not concerned with the photographer's life, merely its suggestion of it. A pulse, Watson, may be a metaphor or a machine. But more pressing is why this particular image was sent to me." He handed me the register. "Note the decorations, Distinguished Service Order, and a rare note, Commendation for Discretion. That, my dear fellow, is an unusual quality in war heroes. Discretion implies secrets. I considered this. You suspect the colonel was hiding something. I suspect he died trying to, and someone wants that secret uncovered or possibly buried with him." A knock at the door interrupted us. Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram. It just arrived, Mr. Holmes. From a certain Mr. Lewis. Sent from Paddington Station." Holmes unfolded the slip and read aloud. "Cannot speak at burial. Eyes upon me. Meet at the corner of Gloucester Mews at 8 p.m. Come alone. L. Holmes smiled grimly. Mr. Bites. Lewis is the stiff-backed gentleman from the cemetery. You recognized him. He wore the green ribbon of the Nile expedition, and he had the faintest scar on the jaw. Sword cut, likely Sudanese in origin. His telegram confirms my guess. He stood abruptly. Tonight we shall pay a visit to Gloucester Mews. Until then, I have a small errand to run. Where to? The British Journal of Photography. Someone, Watson, has manipulated light and chemicals to simulate life in a still image. That requires a particular skill, and those with such skills leave traces. That evening, just before the appointed hour, Holmes and I waited in the shadows across from the entrance to Gloucester Mews. The fog had thickened, curling low like a shroud over the cobbled alley. A gas lamp hissed faintly nearby. "Do you think he'll come?" I asked. "If he's still alive, yes," Holmes replied, eyes fixed on the corner. At precisely 8 o'clock, a tall figure emerged from a side lane, his greatcoat drawn close, a flat cap pulled low over his brow. He looked left and right before stepping quickly toward the shadows. "Mr. Lewis?" Holmes said softly. The man stiffened, then nodded once. "I shouldn't be here," he said. "They're watching everything." "Who, Mr. Lewis?" Holmes asked. "Who watches you?" The man glanced around, then leaned close. "The colonel didn't die of heart failure. That's a fabrication. He was—" A sharp report echoed through the alley. A crack like a snapped branch, too loud to be anything but gunfire. Mr. Lewis stumbled backward, a small bloom of blood spreading across his chest. I rushed forward, catching him as he fell. "Holmes, he's been shot!" Holmes dropped beside us, but it was too late. Lewis gasped once, then fell still. Holmes' face was unreadable. He touched the man's coat, inspecting the fabric near the wound. "No powder burns," he murmured. "Shot from a distance. A trained hand." He stood abruptly. "We must go, Watson. We are being observed." As we slipped into the fog, I cast one last look at the lifeless body sprawled in the lamplight. Whatever secret the photograph held, it had now claimed a second life, and the pulse, it seemed, was no longer just in the image, but in the heart of a very real conspiracy. Chapter 3. A Scene of Deception. Word count, 1. Shot or 90 words. The following morning, a bitter chill had crept into London, and the fog had turned from theatrical to oppressive, thick enough to soften even the sharpest outlines of Baker Street into blurred silhouettes. Holmes had scarcely touched his tea, pacing the length of our sitting room like a caged creature whose prey had escaped by inches. "One shot," he muttered. No sound of footsteps, no witness, no powder burns. Precision, purpose, and silence. He stopped abruptly and turned to me. "Watson, we are no longer dealing with a simple case of death. We are treading upon a cover-up." I nodded grimly. The man, Lewis, tried to speak. He said the colonel hadn't died of heart failure. Holmes flicked his fingers in agreement. "Indeed. And someone ensured that knowledge did not reach our ears in full, that someone possesses a rifle, a clean vantage point, and enough resources to follow a military officer into a back alley unnoticed." He stepped to the table and spread out the photograph once more. It still pulsed faintly in the lower left, though whether the effect was chemical, psychological, or something more sinister, I could not say. Holmes lit a match and burned the corner of the envelope it came in. The flame revealed the faintest watermark. "Brunswick Studio, Lambeth." "That," he said, "will be our next destination." Brunswick Studio, nestled behind a row of greengrocers in Lambeth, was a modest affair, red-bricked and windowless, with a single door marked "Private, by appointment only." A brass bell above the entrance chimed softly as Holmes pushed it open. Inside, the room was dim, the smell of photographic chemicals hanging heavy in the air. A tall man emerged from behind a black curtain, his sleeves stained with developer fluid and his beard speckled with white streaks. "Gentlemen," he said stiffly, "we're not accepting walk-ins." Holmes removed his hat. "We're not here for portraits. We're here about this." He extended the photograph. The man took it and squinted at it under a yellowed desk lamp. He blinked twice, then tilted it. When he saw the pulsing effect, he let out a long breath and lowered the image as though it burned his fingertips. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "Does it matter?" Holmes replied smoothly. "You developed it, Mr. Arthur Quill," the man said. "But no, I did not." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "And yet it bears your watermark." "I rent space to others. A few amateurs use my dark room on Saturdays. I oversee, but I don't meddle, unless they damage the chemicals or equipment." "When was this photograph printed?" Holmes asked. Quill scratched his beard. 10 days ago. Late. I remember because it was the only session that day. A man came in, very particular about the lighting. Said he was photographing an old family portrait. Wanted it enhanced. Holmes leaned in. "Did you see the original?" "No, it was already in the frame. He wouldn't open it. Just wanted a reproduction, but he insisted the exposure be exact." "What did he look like?" Quill hesitated. "Wiry fellow. Pale, unremarkable features. But he wore gloves the whole time. That struck me as odd." Holmes nodded slowly. "And he left no name?" "Paid in cash. Took the photo and the plate. He asked that the negative be destroyed afterward." "And did you?" "I always keep a copy, Mr. Holmes." "Artists are sentimental." Holmes' face brightened slightly. "Then we'd like to see it." Quill disappeared into a side room, returning moments later with a small envelope. Inside was a photographic negative, wrapped in wax paper. Holmes held it to the light, examining the grain and exposure. "Well?" I asked. "The original portrait was altered," he said flatly. "See here." He pointed to the colonel's chest. "The faintest shadow just beneath the lapel. It's not part of the original clothing. It was painted or superimposed, something to mimic motion, the effect of a pulse." "Why go through the trouble?" Holmes gave a thin smile. "Because someone wished to imply the colonel was not dead, or that his image was somehow still alive. Either way, it is a misdirection." He handed the negative back to Quill. "This may be of great interest to the Yard before long. I suggest you keep it somewhere secure." Back at Baker Street, Holmes immediately began scribbling in his notebook, lines of connections branching out like veins. "Consider, Watson," he said as he wrote. "A colonel dies quietly of alleged heart failure. Days later, a photograph appears that suggests otherwise. Then, a witness tries to speak and is shot. Finally, we find that the image was tampered with to simulate life." He paused, tapping his pencil on the edge of the page. "There is more here than death. There is a message. The photograph was meant to be seen, but not by everyone, only by someone capable of interpreting it. Someone like you, or like Colonel Addleton." I blinked. "Are you suggesting the message was intended for the dead?" Holmes turned his piercing gaze on me. "Or from him?" At that moment, there was a soft knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with a letter. No envelope this time, simply a folded note sealed with dark blue wax. Holmes broke the seal and read silently. Then, without a word, handed it to me. It read, "Do not trust the woman in mourning. She lies with her eyes and speaks with her gloves. She was never meant to be there." There was no signature. I looked up. "The woman from the funeral, the one crying?" Holmes nodded. "Now we must return to the colonel's past, and to that woman's future." He stood, taking his coat once more. "We are being fed truths in pieces, Watson, deliberately so. The question is not whether we can see the full picture. It is, Who else has seen it already? Chapter 4. The Gathering of Suspects. By noon the next day, we found ourselves once more in Lambeth, this time not in pursuit of a shadowy photographer or altered image, but in the drawing room of Colonel Julius Addleton's former residence, number 5 Percival Row. It was a narrow townhouse of modest height, yet its contents bore the mark of wealth collected rather than inherited. Foreign relics, brass instruments, and a lion's skull mounted above the fireplace. Holmes moved through the space like a hound unleashed, eyes darting from corner to corner. "Not the home of a bachelor," I remarked. "At least, not a typical one." Holmes gave a dry smile. "Not typical, no, but precisely, almost obsessively so. Everything in its place, down to the angle of the books on the shelf. The Colonel had no room in his life for disorder. And yet he left behind chaos. Or someone carefully curated the illusion of it." A sharp knock interrupted our inspection. The butler, a tall, dour man named Greaves, entered and cleared his throat with theatrical restraint. "They have arrived, sir." "Excellent," Holmes said. "Please show them in." One by one they entered the drawing room, figures drawn together by the gravity of the Colonel's death, and, perhaps more pointedly, by the photograph's unspoken accusation. First was Mrs. Beatrice Lyle, the woman in mourning. Tall, pale, and composed, her dark veil now drawn back to reveal an angular face with keen, pale eyes that never seemed to settle on one point for long. She was followed by Major Reginald Barr, the stern-jawed man from the cemetery. Still in military attire, he offered only the barest nod before seating himself stiffly in the corner. Next came Mr. Victor Fern, a small man with darting eyes and thinning hair, who reeked of tobacco and nervous sweat. Introduced as the Colonel's solicitor, he carried a leather case that never left his grip. And lastly, Miss Clara Addleton, a young woman in her early 20s, slim and dark-haired, with the sallow complexion of someone unaccustomed to sunlight. She bore a striking resemblance to the Colonel, perhaps a niece. Holmes stood at the hearth, hands behind his back, casting his gaze across them like a professor about to lecture a classroom. "I thank you all for agreeing to this meeting," he began, "though I suspect some of you came more out of curiosity or caution than obligation." There was a soft rustle of movement. No one spoke. Holmes continued, "I am investigating the circumstances surrounding Colonel Addleton's death. Not for the police, not for scandal, but because something in this matter is not as it should be. I believe you all know that already." Still no response. Holmes turned to Greaves. "Tea, please." The butler nodded and withdrew. Holmes took a slow breath and then gestured toward the photograph now laid on the mantelpiece. "Before we begin, I must ask, has anyone here seen this image before?" Clara rose slightly, eyes wide. "That was on the Colonel's desk, just days before he passed. Did you observe anything unusual about it?" She hesitated. I thought I imagined it. The photos seemed to flicker, only for a second." "Thank you," Holmes said gently. "And you, Mrs. Lyle?" She sniffed. "I've not seen that photograph before today." "Odd," Holmes said, "as it was sent anonymously to my rooms, with a message warning of deception. Deception which, I suspect, surrounds the Colonel's final days." Beatrice stiffened. "Are you accusing me, Mr. Holmes?" "I accuse no one. I observe. And what I observe is this. A colonel dies quietly. A photograph of him is altered to suggest he lives. A man attempts to tell the truth and is shot in the street, and now we are gathered in a room filled with grief, secrets, and smoke." Mr. Fern cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. Holmes, if I may, Julius was under tremendous pressure in the final months of his life. He was concerned about security." "Security?" "He believed he was being watched, spoke of letters intercepted, windows opened when he was away. I thought it was paranoia, but now—" Holmes tilted his head. "And did he tell you what he feared?" Fern shifted uncomfortably. Not in detail, only that he'd once made enemies in the service. Old ghosts, he said. From India. Holmes paced slowly. Did any of you know the Colonel's habits in his final weeks? Whom he saw? What he said? Major Barr finally spoke, his voice dry as dust. He became reclusive, suspicious. Called me over once to look at scratches beneath his window. He believed someone had entered. Had they? I found nothing, but I believed he believed it. Mrs. Lyle folded her gloved hands. Perhaps guilt haunted him. He had many secrets. Holmes's eyes flicked to her gloves. Yes, about that. May I ask why you wear them indoors, madam? Beatrice hesitated. Cold hands. Holmes smiled thinly. And yet your teacup is untouched. No attempt to warm them. Forgive my curiosity. It's a professional habit. Before she could respond, Greaves returned with the tea service. Holmes used the moment to circle behind Beatrice and gently lift her veil, which had slid to the side. Beneath, a faint bruise was visible near her temple. An accident? He asked. She drew in a sharp breath, eyes flashing. I slipped on the stairs, the day after the funeral. Holmes held her gaze for a moment longer, then turned away. Indeed. He poured tea for each guest and resumed his station at the mantel. Each of you held a place in Colonel Addleton's final chapter, whether as kin, colleague, confidant, or caretaker. I do not yet know which of you is lying, but I do know this. Someone altered a photograph to make a dead man speak, and someone silenced another man before he could explain why. He let the words settle, thick as the fog outside. We shall speak again, individually, but for now, let me leave you with a final question. He turned to them, eyes suddenly gleaming with energy. Where was the Colonel the night before he died? And who was with him? Clara's eyes widened. Fern fidgeted. Major Barr's jaw clenched, and Beatrice Lyle smiled. Only Holmes saw it, a smile as thin and precise as a razor's edge. Chapter 5. First Suspects. The Red Herring. 2 days after the curious gathering at Colonel Addleton's home, a knock sounded upon the door of Baker Street just after breakfast. Mrs. Hudson announced the arrival of Inspector Tobias Gregson of Scotland Yard, his boots still damp with morning mist, and his coat buttoned to the throat. Holmes, Gregson said briskly, we've made an arrest. Holmes, who had been lounging with his eyes closed and fingertips together, opened one eye. Have you now? Indeed. Beatrice Lyle, the woman from the funeral. On what grounds? I asked, startled. Gregson pulled a small notepad from his coat. An eyewitness came forward, a neighbor of Addleton's, Mrs. Hepworth. Swears she saw Miss Lyle leave the Colonel's house the night before his death, near midnight. Claims she was arguing with him on the front steps. And the witness waited nearly 2 weeks to say anything, Holmes asked dryly. She says she was afraid, but we searched Miss Lyle's flat this morning and found this. He produced a small blood-stained handkerchief from his inner pocket, initialed BL, found buried under loose floorboards. Holmes accepted it with mild interest. Type O negative blood. Quite rare. You can tell that by looking? I asked. I can infer it, Watson. Colonel Addleton's medical file from his service record confirms he was O negative. This is most likely his. So, Gregson said, we've got motive, presence at the scene, and physical evidence. What more do you need? Only one thing, Holmes said, standing and stretching lazily. A theory that doesn't feel rehearsed. Gregson frowned. You believe she's innocent? Holmes walked to the window and parted the curtain slightly. No, Inspector. I believe she's guilty of something, but not murder. That afternoon, Holmes and I paid a visit to Scotland Yard, where Beatrice Lyle sat in a small grey-walled interview room, her gloves finally removed and her composure now cracked. She looked up as we entered. "Come to watch the execution, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes sat across from her without responding. He studied her face, then her hands. There were bruises around 2 fingers, deep purple fading at the edges. "Your hands," he said. "Those aren't from a fall." She flinched. "You have no right." "No right to guess," Holmes interjected. "But I don't know, Mrs. Lyle. Those are defensive bruises. You struck someone or blocked a strike. I'd wager within 24 hours of the Colonel's death." Her mouth tightened. "Did he hit you?" Holmes asked quietly. She looked away. "We argued. It became physical. I slapped him. He grabbed my arm. That's all." "What was the argument about?" "I wanted the letters," she said after a pause. "He had written them years ago, during his time in India, to a woman who wasn't me." Holmes's eyes flickered. "You feared scandal." "I feared destruction. He said he'd destroy them himself, but he lied. I knew he kept them. I wanted them back." "Did you find them?" "No." Her voice cracked. "He wouldn't tell me where." He laughed, said they'd already been read by someone who mattered. "Meaning?" She didn't answer. Holmes leaned forward. "The man who developed the photograph. He said your gloves were unusual, not silk, lined with lead thread, to avoid contact with certain chemicals." Beatrice blinked. "What are you implying?" "That you're not who you pretend to be. I believe you came to the funeral to monitor reactions, not to mourn. You were looking for something, weren't you? Something in the photograph." She said nothing, but her expression shifted, just enough to confirm Holmes's suspicion. He stood. "You'll be released shortly. Scotland Yard will likely delay it, but the truth has momentum now, and it doesn't move in your favor or theirs. I suggest you use the time to decide which side of the secret you wish to be on." As we exited the room, I turned to Holmes. "She's lying, but not about everything." "No," he said. "Just the parts that matter most." Back at Baker Street, we found Gregson waiting for us, pacing beside the fireplace. "She's not talking," he said, annoyed. "Not even to her solicitor." "She will," Holmes said calmly. "But by then, she may be talking about the wrong crime." Gregson looked confused. "You don't think she killed the Colonel?" "I think she fought with him, yes. And I think she came back after he died. To retrieve something, but not to murder." Gregson crossed his arms. "Then who?" Holmes poured himself a brandy. "A question too early, Inspector. But let's consider what we've learned. The Colonel feared someone. He believed he was being watched. He kept secret correspondence. He died under mysterious circumstances. And then someone sent a photograph suggesting he lived before ensuring one of the last people who spoke to him was silenced." He turned, brandy in hand. "Does that feel like a jealous lover's doing? Or a conspiracy?" Gregson scored. "Then what am I to do? Release her and chase shadows?" "No, keep her, let her stew, but watch her visitors carefully." That evening Holmes sat with his violin, drawing soft, haunted notes as I reviewed my scribbled notes from the day's interviews. The photograph lay once more on the desk beside me. "There is something that still troubles me, Holmes," I said finally. "If Beatrice Lyle wasn't the killer, why plant the handkerchief?" Holmes stopped playing. "Ah, the crucial question. Someone wants her to take the fall." "Yes." "Then they must have access. To her flat, to the Colonel's medical history, to the photograph. That narrows the field." "Not as much as you might think," Holmes said. "The Colonel surrounded himself with people who understood secrets, soldiers, lawyers, and a niece with no inheritance to speak of." I looked up. "You suspect Clara?" "I suspect everyone, Watson. But I'm watching who makes the first move now that Beatrice is out of the way." He returned to the violin, playing a darker strain now. Slow, deliberate, as though drawing tension from the strings themselves. Outside, the fog had thickened again, and within it, I feared, the real killer waited, smiling, unseen, and patient. Chapter 6. A missing window and a misplaced key. Poirot stood in the center of the study, his gloved hands behind his back, his mustache slightly twitching with thought. The fire crackled faintly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows against the walls. Inspector Japp leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "I must admit, Poirot," said Japp, "the more we dig, the murkier it gets. No footprints, no signs of forced entry, and no clear motive, unless one takes into account the family inheritance. But even that's not solid." Poirot turned toward the fireplace, inspecting the delicate porcelain figurines on the mantel. His voice was quiet, but deliberate. "It is always like a painting, mon ami. At first, all appears as brushstrokes, but when one steps back, then the picture begins to take form." Before Japp could respond, Mrs. Ainsley, the housekeeper, reappeared. "Monsieur Poirot, you asked to see the window locks in the deceased's bedroom." "Oui, madame. Kindly show me." The trio climbed the stairs again, this time in a different mood. The hallway felt narrower, more oppressive. The late afternoon sun now filtered through the lace curtains, throwing soft patterns onto the carpet. Mrs. Ainsley opened the door to Miss Verity's bedroom, revealing an elegant room that bore no signs of a struggle. Poirot walked to the window. "It was not opened last night." Mrs. Ainsley shook her head. "I closed and latched it myself before supper. Miss Verity disliked the night air. She often said it reminded her of childhood fevers." Poirot examined the latch, fingers gentle, then pushed the window outward. It resisted. He nodded. Locked indeed. And yet Inspector Japp found no indication that the door was forced. "So if our mysterious visitor entered this room, it was through a moment." He turned back to Mrs. Ainsley. "Is there another way in?" "Well, there's the corridor, of course, but that's the only door." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "And the key? Was it in the door this morning?" "No," she said. "It was on the dressing table, just there." "Interesting," murmured Poirot, stepping over to it. The brass key rested beside a silver-backed hairbrush, seemingly placed with care. He looked at it without touching. So whoever locked the door must have used this key, then returned it. "But why would someone do that?" Japp asked. "Why lock her in and then leave the key in plain sight?" Poirot's response was a knowing glance. To buy time, perhaps, to delay discovery of the body, or to make the death seem natural by removing suspicion of intrusion. Mrs. Ainsley's hands wrung nervously in her apron. But who would do such a thing? Miss Verity was loved. She was kind. Poirot offered a polite nod, then turned to Japp. "May we speak again with Mr. Felix?" Japp gave a grunt. "Let's get to it." Downstairs in the conservatory, Felix Rathbone stood near the tall windows, absently fiddling with a chess piece from a set on a marble-topped table. His gaze drifted to the garden, where the last of the roses struggled against the oncoming autumn. Poirot stepped into the room and greeted him with a courteous bow. "Monsieur Rathbone, I ask for your patience once again." Felix looked weary but nodded. "Anything to help?" "You and Miss Verity," Poirot began. "You were close?" Felix's lips tightened. "We understood each other. I admired her greatly." Poirot's gaze didn't leave him. Admiration is not always returned. "Was your admiration ever rejected?" Felix hesitated. "We were companions of a sort, but Verity—" She kept her thoughts locked. "I never pushed." Poirot took a step closer. "And yet last night you argued with her." Felix's jaw twitched. "Yes, I wanted her to stop sponsoring Elspeth's painting career. She was throwing money at a hopeless cause." "Elspeth being your sister?" Felix nodded. "She has no talent, but Verity had this absurd notion she needed to rescue Elspeth. Charity for the sake of legacy, she called it. But it wasn't her legacy to give." Poirot tilted his head. "Was it a heated argument?" "Yes," Felix admitted. "But I left before it got worse. Around 10. She said she wanted to be alone, and I obliged." Did anyone see you afterward? I played cards with Aunt Lillian and Mr. Fogg until midnight. Poirot made a mental note. Merci, Monsieur Rathbone. That will be all, for now. As they exited the conservatory, Japp whispered, "He's hiding something." "Mais bien sûr," Poirot replied. "So are most people in this house. The question is, what?" Later, that evening, Poirot sat at the small writing desk in the guest room lent to him, sifting through the notes he had taken throughout the day. Clues formed a hazy outline in his mind, but something remained off. It wasn't just who had killed Verity, but why the entire household seemed cloaked in a veil of fear and silence. He glanced at the small velvet pouch he'd taken from the drawer in Verity's room. A pouch containing a single cameo brooch with an inscription on the back. To V.L. "Let no shadow claim your light." S. S. Poirot murmured. Who is S? A knock interrupted his thoughts. Mrs. Ainsley entered once more, this time with a tray of tea and biscuits. "You haven't eaten all day." Poirot smiled. "Ah, you are most kind. Tell me, madame, did Miss Verity ever mention someone with the initial S?" She paused, brows furrowed. "Not that I recall. She kept most of her correspondence locked in her writing desk, but wait, there was a young man. Stephen. Something. He used to write her from the front during the war. They were close, I think." "Stephen, you say? Was he family?" No, just a friend. But he stopped writing long ago." Poirot's eyes glittered. "Was he perhaps presumed dead?" Mrs. Ainsley nodded. "Verity wore black for nearly a year after the war ended. Said she never wanted to forget." Poirot leaned back. "Madame, would you be so good as to bring me her writing box?" "Of course." As she exited, Poirot turned his thoughts inward. A forgotten lover, a secret brooch, a locked door, and a vanished window of opportunity. The pieces were there, scattered across the chessboard. But who had made the first move? And more importantly, who would dare make the last? Chapter 7. The luggage that shouldn't have been. The rain fell harder as the night deepened, the patter of water against the windows mirroring the quiet storm building inside Poirot's mind. He stood near the fireplace, one hand behind his back, the other gently twisting the end of his mustache. Miss Dunlow sat nearby, pale and watching him with the expression of someone who'd been holding her breath for far too long. "Your father's suitcase," Poirot said slowly, "was not in his room, nor with his body when it was discovered. Yet Lady Margaret assured me that the valet had brought it up the day before." Miss Dunlow's brows knitted. "You believe it has significance?" Poirot tilted his head. "Mademoiselle, when a man dies unexpectedly, everything of his becomes a potential clue, but especially his luggage." Just then, Inspector Brannigan returned from the East Wing, brushing droplets of rain from his overcoat. "We've checked the guest rooms. No sign of the missing suitcase." "And the servants' quarters?" Poirot asked. Brannigan shook his head. "We'll get there next, but it seems unlikely." Poirot glanced at the hearth where a small scrap of scorched fabric remained half hidden among the ashes. He stooped, retrieved it delicately, and turned it over. A piece of monogrammed cloth, burned but unmistakably bearing the letter E. "Edgar Dunlow," Poirot murmured. "Someone attempted to destroy part of the contents." Miss Dunlow stood up. "That looks like one of Father's handkerchiefs." "Precisely," Poirot said, then looked meaningfully at Brannigan. "If I may suggest, we search the storage area beneath the staircase, a place where something large and unregistered might be hidden." Brannigan nodded and motioned to the constable. Poirot remained in the drawing room with Miss Dunlow as the others went to inspect. The atmosphere was thick, charged with secrets. "Miss Dunlow," he began gently, "you spoke earlier of a disagreement your father had during his final dinner. Who was the recipient of his anger?" She hesitated. He was arguing with my aunt, Lady Margaret. But it wasn't the first time. Father always suspected she was draining the estate with her charities and parties. He said she was hiding something in the ledgers, that things didn't add up. Poirot nodded slowly. And did your father have evidence? I don't know. He said he would confront her after the weekend and take full control of the estate. Poirot's eyes narrowed. That would make his sudden death rather convenient. A loud clatter interrupted them, followed by a voice shouting, "Inspector, over here!" Brannigan reappeared, breathless, carrying a dark leather suitcase slick with dust and cobwebs. He placed it on the table with a grunt. Poirot stepped forward, using a handkerchief to open the clasps. Inside, the contents were in disarray: several shirts, some toiletries, and a file of documents tied together with twine. Poirot removed the file. Ah, the missing ledgers. He turned a few pages, his eyes scanning the numbers quickly. Then he stopped, lips tightening. "This," he said, holding up a page, "is a record of estate expenditures. Here, see? Funds diverted to a non-existent foundation, large sums, regularly over the last year. Signed repeatedly by Lady Margaret." Brannigan cursed under his breath, but Poirot wasn't finished. "And this note?" He held up a small, torn piece of paper, written in haste. A warning, perhaps. Miss Dunlow read aloud. "Do not eat anything Margaret gives you. She suspects." Her voice trembled. A cold silence followed. Poirot carefully packed the documents again, setting them aside. "So, now we know. Monsieur Dunlow discovered financial fraud. He intended to confront his sister, who had every reason to fear exposure. A missing suitcase, partially burned belongings, and a note warning of poison. Brannigan said, 'We'll bring her in. Start with questions.' But Poirot held up a hand. 'Not yet. The murder, mon ami, is like a theatrical play. We are not yet at the final act.' He turned to Miss Dunlow. 'One final question, mademoiselle. Did your father, in his last day or so, complain of discomfort, dizziness, a bitter taste?' She nodded slowly. 'Yes. He said the wine was unusually sharp, and he had headaches all day.' Poirot nodded. 'I suspected as much. Poison, perhaps digitalis or belladonna. Slow, subtle, enough to induce collapse without immediate suspicion.' Brannigan's jaw tensed. 'We'll send for the coroner again, with this new context.' Poirot glanced toward the staircase. 'Before we accuse Lady Margaret, we must consider one more thing.' 'What's that?' Poirot's voice was calm but chilling. Whether she was working alone. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside Dunlow Manor, it was the quiet now that frightened them most. Chapter 8. The Button and the Silence. The cab ride back to Whitehaven was a study in unspoken questions. Poirot, nestled in thought, tapped his cane softly against the floor while Hastings stared blankly out the window, trying to piece together the fragments of their investigation. The morning fog had returned, curling around the tires like smoke, and the grey light gave the streets a stage-like gloom, as if the whole of Whitehaven were preparing for a second act. Once they returned to the boarding-house, Poirot wasted no time. "Mademoiselle Lily is out," informed Mrs. Kilpatrick from the parlor doorway. Her knitting needles paused mid-air. "Took a walk toward the pier, I believe. Said she needed air." "Bon," Poirot said without missing a beat. "And our Miss Waverley?" "Upstairs still, quiet as a church mouse." Poirot gave a gracious nod. "Merci, madame. Please inform Miss Waverley we wish to speak with her." As the landlady vanished up the creaky stairs, Poirot turned to Hastings. "The tension in this house is like the tightening of a spring, and we are getting closer to the snap." Miss Waverley entered 5 minutes later, dressed in her usual crisp blouse and skirt, her fingers fidgeting with the lace hem. I didn't expect you so soon," she murmured. "We are close to understanding something vital, mademoiselle," Poirot said gently. "But your help is needed to sharpen the final image. You worked closely with Mrs. Beckett. N'est-ce pas? She nodded. Did she ever mention fears, worries, something more recent than her grief? Waverley hesitated, biting her lip. She had become tense, particularly after seeing that man, the stranger, on the cliff walk last Thursday. She didn't describe him, only said he reminded her of something she'd tried to forget. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Something she tried to forget? Yes, but she refused to elaborate. Did she have a diary, somewhere she might record her thoughts? Only a small notebook she kept by her bed. I never read it, of course. Poirot stood. Then we must see this notebook. It may contain the ghost of a motive. They ascended to Mrs. Beckett's old room, now stripped of most of her belongings, though her notebook remained untouched on the nightstand. Poirot picked it up gently, thumbing through the worn pages. At first, the entries were mundane, lists, short reflections, verses from scripture, but the final 2 pages struck him as different. Thursday. I saw the man again. He watched from the path above but said nothing. If it is truly him, then everything I tried to leave behind has followed me to Whitehaven. Friday, I dreamed of the baby's cry again. I know it's only a dream, but in the wind, I hear it still. Poirot let out a slow breath. Mon ami, I do believe we are not dealing with a crime of simple greed or passion. This woman was haunted by something far older than her time in this boarding house. Hastings leaned in. You think it's about the child? The one she lost? Poirot glanced sharply at him. Not lost, hidden, or worse, taken. The tone suggests guilt, perhaps even complicity. At that moment, a knock echoed from downstairs. Mrs. Bury. Kilpatrick's voice rang up. Inspector Drew's here. Poirot and Hastings descended. Drew stood stiffly in the hallway, his face unreadable. 2 things, he began. First, the autopsy report. Drowning is confirmed as cause of death, but she had bruises, one above her collarbone, consistent with a quick, forceful grab. Not enough to suggest a struggle, but something to note. Second, he opened his hand to reveal a silver button. This was found embedded in the mud at the shore, very close to where her body washed up. Doesn't match her clothes. Poirot took it with tweezers from his pocket, examining its surface. It was polished and marked with an engraved crown symbol. Military issue, he said softly. Or possibly ceremonial. Hastings leaned over. Does anyone here own a coat with buttons like that? Poirot did not answer. He turned on his heel and made his way outside. Come, Hastings, we go to the pier. The sea air bit at their cheeks as they approached the dock. Lily stood there, wrapped in a pale shawl, her back to them, staring into the grey expanse. When she turned, her eyes were rimmed red. Did you find something? Poirot held out the button. Does this look familiar, mademoiselle? She looked at it for a long moment, then slowly nodded. It's from Harold's coat. He used to wear it when he came home from training. He always looked so proud in it. Poirot's expression didn't change. Did Mrs. Beckett know Harold? Lily blinked. No, not directly. I told her about him, of course. I used to show her his letters. May I ask, did she ever react unusually to them? She cried once. Said she envied me for having someone to love. Poirot leaned closer. Are you quite sure she never met him? Lily hesitated. She might have seen a photograph I kept on the mantel. She asked about him, I think. Why? Poirot turned away slowly. Because, mademoiselle, I believe your fiancé was the last ghost she ever saw. They walked back toward the boarding house, silence folding between them. Inside, Poirot placed the silver button beside the notebook and turned toward Hastings. There is a shape forming. A man with a military background. A child whose existence was concealed. A woman who saw a ghost. Or perhaps merely a reminder of a crime. And now, a clue from the sea. Hastings frowned. But if the button belonged to Lily's fiancé, what could that possibly mean? Poirot gave a small smile. Not necessarily to him. It could mean someone wanted us to believe it belonged to him. But either way, we must speak with this Harold, if he still lives. And as the clock in the hallway struck 6, its chime deep and solemn, Poirot whispered, "La vérité se lève." The truth is rising, mon ami, and it waits for no one. Chapter 9. Whispers in the cellar rain began to patter softly on the window panes of the manor as dusk surrendered to night. A chilly dampness clung to the air, and the great house seemed to draw in upon itself like a wounded beast. Poirot sat near the fireplace in the drawing-room, the flames casting orange light across his meticulous features as he steepled his fingers in thought. Beside him, Inspector Lemoine thumbed a leather-bound notebook filled with scribbles and question marks. Both men had just finished interviewing Simone for the second time. "Mon ami," Poirot said finally, breaking the heavy silence. "We are walking in circles, but not without progress. There is something in this house that is very old, very angry, and very well hidden." Lemoine glanced at him, confused. "You mean the secret the Countess alluded to?" "Exactement. She said the dog howled once and never again. That, my friend, is a metaphor, I'm certain of it. Someone, or something, silenced a voice long ago in this house, and I intend to find out whose." At that moment, the drawing-room doors creaked open, and Marie the maid stepped in, her eyes wide. "Monsieur Poirot, there's something you must see." "In the cellar." Poirot and Lemoine exchanged a glance. Cellars in houses like Château de Rochefort were seldom innocent. Poirot stood, adjusted his cuffs, and nodded. "Lead the way, mademoiselle." Marie hesitated at the top of the stairwell leading down into the earth. "The light doesn't work down there anymore," she whispered. "But I heard footsteps, scraping sounds, and when I went to check, this was on the wall." She handed Poirot a folded piece of parchment. It was old, browned with age and curling at the edges. In the flickering firelight, he read, "One howl for the truth, and silence for the dead. Beneath the bones of hounds, the traitor's sin is set." Poirot looked up sharply. "The bones of hounds. How curious. Shall we?" They descended into the cellar with only lanterns to light their path. The walls wept with condensation, and the air was thick with mildew. Rows of wine racks stood like sentinels, long abandoned. Near the rear wall, a patch of stone was noticeably newer than the rest, less aged, less mottled with moss. Poirot tapped it gently with his cane, and the sound rang hollow. "A false wall," Lemoine muttered. Poirot knelt and examined the mortar with his magnifying lens. "Indeed, and recently sealed. Within the last year, I'd wager." Together, they pried at the stones until a section gave way with a dusty groan. Behind it was a narrow crawl space. Lemoine raised his lantern and cursed under his breath. Bones. Dozens of them, heaped in a careless pile. Some animal, some human. Among them, a rotting velvet satchel, still clasped with an iron ring. Poirot retrieved it gently and opened it on a crate. Inside were brittle letters, sealed with the Rochefort family crest. The ink had faded, but the contents were legible. He began reading aloud. "To the Duke Henri de Rochefort, if you ever read this, know that your brother's blood is on your hands. You protected the traitor, and our family paid the price. The hound's cry was my vengeance, but silence, true silence, was the debt I owed him. Isabelle." Lemoine blinked. Isabelle. But she was the Countess's great-aunt, no? "Oui," Poirot murmured. "And this confirms that the legend of the howling dog is no mere ghost tale. It marks a murder, hidden beneath centuries of pride." Suddenly, footsteps echoed above. Quick, retreating. Poirot looked up. Someone was listening. They rushed back upstairs, following the creaking of floorboards and the muffled thud of retreating boots. In the dim hallway, Simone stood clutching the old portrait of Isabel, her eyes filled with tears. "She wasn't mad," she said, voice trembling. "They said she lost her mind after the war, but she was right." "Wasn't she?" She knew something. Poirot approached gently. "You read the letters?" "I saw one once, years ago. Papa found it hidden in Isabel's books and burned it. He said it was poison. But she was trying to tell the truth." "And now?" "Now you've found the bones." Lemoyne frowned. "You mean your father destroyed evidence?" Simone looked down. "Papa always said the family name mattered more than ghosts. More than the truth. That's why the dogs stopped howling. They punished it. They buried everything, including the bodies." Poirot's brow furrowed. "But someone still guards the secret. Who?" At that, Simone's gaze shifted toward the east wing. "There's one person who knows more than she admits. My grandmother. Odette." Lemoine looked incredulous. "She's nearly deaf and can barely speak." Simone shook her head. "She's not deaf. She pretends. Ever since the fire, she's been pretending." Poirot's interest sharpened. "May I speak with her? Alone?" They found Odette seated by her window, gazing out into the storm. Her white hair was pinned neatly, and her eyes, sharp even in age, met Poirot's without surprise. "You've found the bones," she said, before he spoke a word. Poirot nodded. "And a truth buried with them." She sighed. "Then it's nearly over." "You've known all along, madame." "I was a girl when it happened. Isabel tried to warn them, but no one would listen. She had proof. Letters, deeds, even a will. Henri betrayed his own brother during the war to gain the title. Isabel swore revenge." Poirot leaned forward. "And the dog?" "She trained it to attack on command. It mauled Henri the night before he was to wed. But it wasn't the dog who killed him." Poirot went still. "Then who?" Odette's hands trembled slightly. "Isabel. She used the chaos as cover, and then she vanished. Some say she drowned. I believe she went mad. Or perhaps simply went silent." Poirot rose. "Thank you, madame. You have given voice to the silence." As he and Lemoine walked back toward the study, the inspector muttered, "This family is like a crypt. Every wall holds a body." Poirot nodded. "And we have not yet unearthed the last one." Outside, thunder rolled again, as if in response, and somewhere deep within the manor, the wind passed through a broken window with a long, low moan, almost like a howl. Chapter 10. The blood beneath the ink. The gas lamps along Fleet Street hissed faintly as dusk settled over London. Inside the dim, paper-scented stillness of the Globe publishing house, Hercule Poirot sat once again in the cramped editorial office of Cyril Ponsonby. Outside, the clatter of printers and typewriters had quieted for the day. A shadowed calm, too calm, hovered in the air. Across from Poirot, Miss Lydia Worthing leaned against a filing cabinet, arms folded tightly across her chest. Her eyes were fixed on the floor as if expecting it to open and reveal some buried truth. Inspector Japp stood near the door, chewing on the end of a pencil. "We're chasing ghosts," Lydia finally muttered. "First Winchell, now Elliot. Everyone who touched that manuscript, gone or hunted." Poirot folded his hands across his chest. "No, mademoiselle, not ghosts. We are chasing something or someone far more tangible." Japp glanced up. "You really think someone killed Winchell for that manuscript? A satire about the publishing world?" Poirot lifted a finger. "Not satire. Allegory. Words can be dangerous things, my friend. Sharp as razors, and some truths, when exposed, are intolerable to those who live by the shadows." He turned his attention to the manuscript again, which lay unbound on the desk, now with its final chapters miraculously returned. Elliot Farnsworth's mysterious benefactor had indeed mailed them, unsigned and without a return address, in a brown envelope marked only "To be delivered." Japp leaned in. "So what's in these last pages? Something worth killing for?" Poirot smiled gently. "Let us find out." He opened the final pages. Lydia moved beside him, her breath shallow. As Poirot read aloud, the room grew still. And so the editor, clever, conniving, hid the truth under footnotes and fake names. The printer who once knew too much died in a so-called accident. The typesetter who asked questions was silenced with a coin and a warning in the night. The satire ends not with laughter, but with a body at the foot of a press. Ink, blood, and ambition, the holy trinity of Fleet Street. Japp stared. "You think this is all literal?" Poirot tapped the page. "Not literal, Inspector, but inspired by reality. It is no coincidence that the editor in the story closely resembles Mr. Ponsby, same gait, same fondness for snuff, nor that the typesetter resembles the late Winchell. Monsieur Farnsworth may have cloaked truth in fiction, but fiction often speaks with an unfiltered tongue." Lydia's voice cracked. "But who would care enough to kill over it? If it's just a Roman à clef—" Poirot interrupted her softly. "Mademoiselle, you said Elliot was working on an exposé, yes?" She nodded. "He mentioned it once. Said he was going to burn down the hypocrisy of the London press with nothing but paper and ink. And the only people who knew were you, Ponsby, and perhaps one other," Poirot said. He turned his gaze toward the office window. A shadow moved quickly outside. Japp spun and flung the door open. "Oi!" But the corridor was empty. Poirot stepped to the window and examined the sill. "Someone is watching," he murmured, "which means we are drawing too near." Lydia's eyes widened. "Then we need protection. You, me, everyone still tied to that story." "Protection will only go so far," Poirot replied. "We must draw out the killer. Reveal what they fear most." Japp frowned. "You got a plan, Poirot?" "Oui. But first we must know what exactly Farnsworth was exposing. Something deeper than professional rivalries. Something buried beneath the layers of literary metaphor." Poirot turned back to Lydia. "You said Farnsworth had a personal vault at the university library." "Yes," she said slowly. "Rare manuscript section. He kept notes there, unpublished chapters. He said the truth was too dangerous to keep at home." "Then that is where we must go. Tonight." The rare manuscripts room at King's College Library was a temple of silence. Tall shelves lined with leather-bound volumes loomed like sentinels, their spines glinting in the lamplight. The librarian, a thin man with pince-nez and nicotine-stained fingers, handed over the sealed black case with a trembling hand. "He said only someone with a key phrase could open it," the librarian murmured. "A sort of literary passcode." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "And that phrase was?" The librarian cleared his throat. "Truth is a dagger with no hilt." "Charming," Japp muttered. The case clicked open. Inside lay a sheaf of papers and a yellowed notebook, pages marked in neat, slanted handwriting. Lydia gasped. His research journal. Poirot flipped through the notebook. Each page was filled with names, annotations, sketches, not of characters, but of real men. Editors, columnists, printers, and then a name circled multiple times. Albert Compton. Poirot stiffened. "Mon Dieu!" Japp peered over his shoulder. "Compton. Wasn't he that bigwig editor from 20 years ago? Vanished in scandal. Disgraced," Lydia added. "He published a hoax. Cost dozens of their reputations, but he was never found. Rumors said he fled to the continent." Poirot's eyes gleamed. Or perhaps he did not flee at all. Perhaps he simply changed his name. Lydia blinked. You don't mean... Poirot closed the journal softly. Yes, mademoiselle. I believe your Mr. Ponsby is none other than Albert Compton, reborn with ink-stained hands and a new identity. Back at Globe Publishing, the air had thickened with an uncanny stillness. Poirot, Lydia, and Japp entered the office once more. Ponsby stood at the window, pouring himself a brandy. Ah, he said without turning. You've returned. Indeed, said Poirot, with answers. Ponsby turned, his smile thin. Then I suggest you share them quickly, before the night consumes us all? Poirot stepped forward. You were Albert Compton. You faked your disgrace, reinvented yourself, but Farnsworth knew. He found records, letters, signatures, style analyses. That manuscript wasn't satire. It was a veiled indictment. He wanted to expose you. Ponsby didn't flinch. And yet I'm here, alive, standing. But Farnsworth is not, Poirot said softly. Lydia's voice shook. Did you kill him? Silence fell like a curtain. Ponsonby's eyes glittered in the low light. No, he said. But I know who did. Poirot's eyebrow arched. Do tell. Ponsby's voice dropped to a whisper. He's been here all along, in these halls, in the ink and the margins. Poirot's spine straightened. You mean... But Ponsby raised his hand. Let me show you. Tomorrow, meet me at the old letterpress room, noon sharp, and bring the manuscript. He turned to the window again. Japp leaned toward Poirot, whispering, He's lying. He's stalling. Poirot's gaze remained fixed on the editor's back. Perhaps, or perhaps, he fears what he's about to become. As they left, Poirot murmured to himself, Tomorrow, then. The final turn of the page. Chapter 11. The truth behind the glass. The morning fog curled gently around the hedges of Thornwick Hall as the dawn light filtered through the thick canopy above. The estate, once a picture of refinement and familial grace, now lay under the cold scrutiny of suspicion and tragedy. Hercule Poirot stood by the garden window in the morning room, arms folded behind his back, eyes narrowed in thought. Inspector Granger entered without knocking, the echo of his boots unusually sharp in the soft-lit room. Morning, Poirot, he said, clearly fatigued. I've interviewed the rest of the household. Nothing out of place, on the surface. But Mrs. Trenholm, the housekeeper, swears she saw Mr. Oliver enter Lady Granville's study the night before the murder. Says he was carrying a crystal decanter. Poirot's brow lifted slightly. Ah, curious. And has the decanter been found? Granger shook his head. No trace of it. Then we must ask ourselves, why bring a drink to one's employer at such a late hour, and not mention it during the interviews? Poirot turned and picked up a silver-framed photograph on the mantel. A younger Lady Granville beside her late husband, Charles Granville. His gaze lingered on the man's smile, too wide, too knowing. You spoke to Miss Evelyn? Poirot asked. Granger nodded. She's still shaken, but cooperative. Doesn't believe anyone in the house would do this. Doesn't trust her Uncle Edward, though. Says he's desperate for inheritance. Poirot tapped his chin. And yet it is Evelyn who inherits the most. A silence stretched between them. Outside, the sun finally broke through, throwing fractured light across the room. Poirot placed the photograph back and made his way toward the grand staircase. He found Oliver Sinclair in the drawing room, his fingers tapping a nervous rhythm against a crystal vase. His eyes darted toward Poirot as the detective entered. Monsieur Sinclair, Poirot began, you did not mention a visit to the study the night of the murder. Why? Sinclair stiffened. Because I didn't think it mattered. Yes, I brought her a nightcap. It was a harmless gesture. She often asked me to. What was in the glass? Brandy. Just brandy. She took it often before bed. And the decanter? I took it back to the pantry, cleaned it. It's not unusual. Ah, but now it is missing. Sinclair's mouth opened slightly. Poirot leaned forward. Someone wants it gone, monsieur. It would be foolish to underestimate the importance of that. Sinclair said nothing, his expression unreadable. Poirot turned to leave, but stopped at the door. And you understand, of course, that Lady Granville's brandy was found laced with belladonna. Sinclair froze. His tapping fingers fell still. Later that afternoon, Poirot joined Evelyn in the solarium. She was seated on a white wicker chair, nursing a cup of tea. Her expression was distant, but not unkind. "You cared for your aunt," Poirot said gently, sitting opposite her. "Yes," Evelyn replied. "She raised me after my parents' accident. I owe her everything." "And yet you feared for her safety, did you not?" She blinked. "How do you mean?" "You mentioned to Inspector Granger that you did not trust your Uncle Edward." "Why?" Evelyn hesitated. "He's always been difficult. A gambler, heavily in debt. He'd begged Aunt Josephine for money more than once. She refused him the last time." Poirot nodded. "And did he threaten her?" "Not directly, but he doesn't take no kindly." Poirot glanced at the garden. "Forgive me, mademoiselle, but were you the one who suggested she have a nightcap that evening?" Evelyn looked startled. "Yes, I thought it might calm her nerves. She'd been upset all afternoon." "Why was that?" "She received a letter, I don't know from whom. She burned it in the fireplace." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "And was she agitated afterward?" "Yes, very." Poirot rose slowly. "Merci, mademoiselle. You have helped more than you know." As the evening descended once more, Poirot returned to the study. The shadows seemed more settled now, the chaos of death replaced with an eerie silence. He walked toward the fireplace and knelt down. With gloved hands, he sifted gently through the ashes. There, amidst the cinders, a corner of scorched paper remained, too fragmented to read, but bearing a crest. He stared at it for a long time before rising. Granger appeared in the doorway. "You've got something?" Poirot nodded. "Indeed. But it is not yet time to reveal the hand. There is one more person I must speak to." "Who?" Poirot gave a small smile. "The one who has said the least, and stood to gain the most." Granger frowned. "Evelyn?" Poirot shook his head. "No. I speak of the one person Lady Granville trusted above all others, her confessor, her secret keeper, the housekeeper, Mrs. Trenholm." And with that, he disappeared down the corridor, footsteps echoing faintly as the mystery deepened around them. Chapter 12. The ink-stained truth. The morning mist had not yet lifted from the narrow streets of Niddington when Poirot, flanked by Inspector Graves and a somewhat pale Judith Langley, returned to the late Basil Cartwright's study. The room greeted them with its usual solemnity. Dark wooden panels, shelves heavy with unread volumes, and the haunting silence that only secrets understand. Poirot stood in the center of the room, his eyes scanning the familiar surroundings. Judith hesitated at the threshold. Poirot gestured gently. "Courage, mademoiselle. It is not the room that holds menace, it is the memory." Judith entered slowly, her gaze falling upon the desk where she had once handed Poirot the letter. Graves leaned near the door, his arms crossed. Poirot moved with care to the desk, his fingers hovering just above the surface, as if sensing vibrations long settled. Then he spoke. "Mademoiselle Judith, you once said you found the letter beneath a stack of legal papers. Do you recall what else was there?" She nodded. "Old files, some letters from the university, a few library slips." Poirot examined the desk drawers methodically, opening one and lifting out a slim sheaf of aging receipts, then another drawer, empty save for a half-used ink bottle and a dried-out quill. But the third drawer revealed something curious. A folded, blue-stamped envelope, its contents still inside. "Graves, if you please." The inspector joined him and peered over his shoulder as Poirot carefully unfolded the note inside. Judith gasped. It's Basil's handwriting. Poirot read aloud, "Should anything happen to me, look to the ink, not the words." Graves looked puzzled. "Sounds like nonsense. Ink instead of words?" But Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Non, mon ami. This is the cleverness of a man who knew he was walking in the lion's den." He turned back to the desk. "May I have a magnifying glass?" Graves handed it over. Poirot leaned close to the surface of the desk and then to the inside of the drawer. "There is a slight discoloration here. Someone cleaned something hastily." Judith spoke up, nervous. "But we never cleaned. Basil always insisted the desk was private. Then someone else came in, someone who needed to make something vanish." He opened the ink bottle. "Empty," he murmured, "but not cleaned. And there." He pointed to a fine reddish residue at the bottle's rim. Graves squinted. "Not ordinary ink." "Not at all," Poirot said. "It is a custom ink formula, likely iron gall or an archival ink. And Basil, I suspect, mixed it with something else, perhaps lemon juice or a secret ingredient, to create invisible writing." Judith's breath caught in her throat. "He wrote a message in invisible ink?" Poirot nodded. "And likely on something no one would think to inspect." He turned his eyes to the bookshelf. One by one, Poirot pulled down a few of Basil's favorite volumes. He ran his hand gently across the pages of Burke's Peerage, then paused at the back cover. He held it to the light, then tilted it again. A faint shimmer. Poirot took a nearby candle, held it under the page, and slowly the heat revealed what the eye could not. A message, in Basil's spidery script, emerged. "I know it was you, Stephen. You wanted the inheritance too much, but I'll not change the will. If I die before Monday, it was no accident." Judith covered her mouth with both hands. Graves straightened. "Stephen Langley. Her cousin." Poirot closed the book with finality. "And now we know what happened the night Basil died," he said. "It was not the food. It was not the wine. It was trust. And it was greed." Judith trembled. "But why the ink? The code?" Poirot looked at her gently. "Because Basil knew Stephen would tamper with his papers. But he hoped someone like me, might uncover the truth." Graves was already moving for the door. "We'll bring Stephen in at once." Poirot stood still a moment longer, glancing once again at the glowing embers of the fireplace, the candle's dim flicker, and the book that had spoken beyond the grave. "Even in death," he said softly, "the truth writes its own story." Chapter 13. The thread unravels. The late afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting a muted golden glow through the high-arched windows of the manor's drawing-room. Poirot sat motionless in a deep crimson armchair, fingers tented beneath his chin. His little grey cells, as he often claimed, were working at full capacity. Across from him, Inspector Japp paced with controlled irritation, his boots making crisp sounds on the wooden floor. "So far, Poirot, you've hinted at motives, questioned everyone from the maid to the gardener, and found a broken teacup. But I don't see how that gets us closer to the murderer." Poirot didn't flinch. "Patience, mon ami. We have reached the final stage of our tapestry. One must look not only at the pattern of lies, but at the single thread that is out of place." The inspector sighed. "You're being cryptic again." Poirot gave a faint smile and tapped the envelope on the table. "This arrived by special delivery this morning. You did not notice?" Japp frowned. "No." "It is from the coroner," Poirot said, opening the envelope with precise fingers. He slid out a thin sheet of paper, scanned it, and nodded to himself. "Well?" Japp leaned forward. The results of the toxicology report. The tea drunk by Madame Warwick before her death contained no poison. No poison? Japp exclaimed. But the teacup was smashed. Ah, you see the brilliance of the misdirection, no? The cup was smashed to make it appear that the poison was in the tea. But it was not. Japp looked confused. Then how? She was poisoned, yes, Poirot said, but not orally. You remember the missing gloves? Japp blinked. Yes, the maid mentioned Madame always wore a pair when outside. Poirot leaned forward. It is because her skin was particularly sensitive. Any contact with irritants would cause an immediate rash. And yet on the morning of her death, she wandered into the garden gloveless. That's odd. Not odd, fatal. The poison was administered through the rose trellis. Japp stared at him. You think the murderer painted poison onto the thorns? Oui. An oil-based compound, absorbed slowly through the skin, leaving no trace in her cup and delaying the onset of symptoms. Quite elegant, n'est-ce pas? Japp turned away, stunned. And the glove? The single glove found by the greenhouse. A discarded piece of the puzzle. The murderer may have removed it to expose her hand at just the right moment. A controlled risk. And do you recall who accompanied her on that walk? Japp thought for a moment. Her niece, Margot. Just so. Poirot stood now, walking to the fireplace. And now, let us consider motive again. Who benefits most? The husband? Japp offered. Poirot shook his head. Too simple. He gains nothing directly. But Margot? She was recently cut from the will, n'est-ce pas, according to the solicitor we spoke with. But she'd be back in the will if the estate passed to the husband and she convinced him. Or, Poirot said softly, if she discovered something that gave her leverage. Madame Warwick was rewriting her will that very week. Margot may have feared being written out permanently. Japp looked skeptical. But where's the proof? Poirot glanced at the grandfather clock. It arrives now, I think. As if on cue, the butler appeared at the door. Sir, Miss Margot is in the study. She said she wishes to speak with you. Excellent, Poirot said smoothly. Inspector, shall we? They followed the butler down the corridor, the sound of their steps echoing off the walls. In the study, Margot stood near the window, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She turned sharply at their entrance. I have something to confess, she said, her voice shaking. It's been weighing on me. Poirot raised a hand. Please, madame. Speak freely. She looked at him, then Japp, and finally dropped into a chair. I knew about the will. Aunt Evelyn was furious at me for asking for money again. She told me she was removing me entirely, and she meant it. Poirot nodded solemnly. And so you confronted her? Margot nodded. Yes, but not to harm her. I only wanted to change her mind. Japp leaned in. Then why lie about the walk? You said she was alone. Margot's lips trembled. Because I knew it would look bad. I helped her through the rose garden. She brushed against a thorn. I didn't think anything of it. I swear. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. And the glove? Margot hesitated. She dropped it. I picked it up. I was going to return it, but then I got scared. Because you realized what might happen, Poirot said gently. You realized her death might look like murder. Tears filled Margot's eyes. I didn't do it. I just didn't want to be blamed. Poirot nodded. Merci. That is all I needed. Japp waited until Margot had been escorted away, then turned to Poirot. Do you believe her? Poirot's face was unreadable. I believe she is not the killer. But she has helped me immensely. Japp groaned. Don't tell me you're still waiting for a final clue. Poirot smiled. No, my friend. I already have it. One tiny inconsistency, overlooked by all but the most meticulous of minds. Japp raised an eyebrow. Which is? Poirot turned to him, his voice low. The letter Madame Warwick was writing before she died. It was addressed to her lawyer, but the ink was still wet when the maid found it, long after her supposed morning walk, meaning the poisoning could not have occurred then. It happened later, in the greenhouse. And who was there? Poirot nodded. Indeed, only one person, the one we least suspected. Come, Inspector. It is time for the curtain to rise. Chapter 14. Shadows in the fog. Poirot stood near the edge of the garden path, his cane tapping thoughtfully against a moss-covered stone. The faint mist that had crept in from the moors was growing thicker, curling through the hedges and swathing the house in an eerie veil. He glanced toward the upper windows of the manor, where the glow of a single lantern flickered like a watchful eye. Behind him, Inspector Morton lit a cigarette, shielding the flame with his hand. There's something strange about this place, Poirot. This fog feels too theatrical, like a stage dressing for a crime that hasn't finished playing out. Poirot gave a faint smile. Très bien, mon ami. Indeed, every curtain drawn and every whispered conversation seems part of a performance. But who, I wonder, writes the script? They walked slowly toward the conservatory. The glass panes shimmered faintly in the low light. Inside, the scent of damp soil and orchids hung in the air. Poirot's eyes swept the room, each pot, each tool, each neglected gardening glove left as if its owner had stepped away only moments before. "Look here," said Morton, crouching by a fern pot. "Footprints." Poirot joined him, peering closely. And not just any footprints. See how the heel digged deeper than the toe? Someone heavy, yet deliberate in step. They were here recently. Morton frowned. And yet Mrs. Everleigh swore no one had used this room since morning. "People often lie," Poirot said softly, "but sometimes they lie simply to preserve a fiction they find comforting." Suddenly, a rustle from behind the glass wall. Poirot raised a hand, and Morton instantly stilled. The detective stepped quietly through the side door into the garden, his footsteps muffled by the fog. In the distance, a shadow detached itself from the hedge, a tall figure in a cloak. "Stop right there," Morton barked, giving chase. But the figure darted into the trees, vanishing like mist. Poirot didn't follow. Instead, he stared down at a small piece of fabric caught on a thorn. He plucked it gently. "A black cloak," he murmured. "Wool. Expensive. This thread does not belong to a gardener." They returned to the house, where a subdued quiet had settled. Inside the drawing room, Miss Lydia sat with her hands clasped tightly, staring into the fire. Her usual poise had frayed. "Miss Lydia," Poirot said kindly, "you were in the library all evening, yes?" "Yes," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was reading. I needed distraction." "And yet," Poirot continued, "I wonder why the book you selected was a volume of legal commentary on inheritance law." She blinked, startled. Well, it was just coincidence. The shelves are full of such things." "Indeed," Poirot said. "But the very page you left it open to discuss is contesting wills. A curious page to stop on, non?" Morton leaned forward. "Did you suspect Richard intended to change his will?" Her lips trembled. He was angry, furious. Not at me, but at something. I overheard him arguing with someone yesterday, a man. He kept shouting that he wouldn't be manipulated. Poirot exchanged a glance with Morton. "You did not recognize the voice?" "No," she whispered. "But he said something strange." Richard shouted, "You'll regret bringing that candle into this house." There was a long silence. Poirot finally said, "The candle again." Morton muttered, "It's like the ghost of this case, following us wherever we look." Poirot turned to the fire. "Non, Inspector. Not a ghost. A signal." He took a slow breath. the pieces aligning in his mind like the careful placement of chessmen. "Come," he said, "we must speak to the staff again, especially Mr. Hallam." Downstairs, the butler waited in the hall, eyes wary but calm. Poirot studied him closely. "You served in the Great War, Mr. Hallam?" "Yes, sir." "And your leg wound still troubles you, yes?" "I manage. Yet tonight I saw you walking without your cane." The man's jaw tightened. Poirot continued, "You were in the conservatory an hour ago. You followed us there. But why?" Hallam didn't answer. Morton stepped forward, but Poirot raised a hand. "No need for pressure, Inspector. Mr. Hallam will speak now. He has been carrying a burden too long." Hallam looked down, his voice barely audible. It was meant to scare him, not kill him. Poirot remained still. "I placed the candle," Hallam confessed. "It belonged to Lady Agatha. It had been locked away since the fire, some say cursed. I thought, if he saw it, if he believed she was watching." "You wanted to frighten Mr. Everley?" Morton asked. Hallam nodded. He was planning to destroy the West Garden. That's where her memorial is, hidden beneath the roses. I couldn't let him erase her. Poirot said gently, "But Mr. Everley died not from fear, but poison." "I didn't do that," Hallam cried. "I swear, I never meant him harm." Poirot's gaze remained cool. "You may not have poisoned him, Mr. Hallam, but you've shown us something vital. This candle, this symbol, it holds power in this house." Power, someone used. Morton crossed his arms. Then who else knew the candle had been moved? Poirot turned toward the window where the fog thickened. "That, my friend, is what we must discover before morning." The storm outside broke softly into rain, and within the shadows of Everley Manor, the final pieces waited, silent, sharp, and ready. Chapter 15. Whispers in the Ruins. The night was drawing close as the last light dimmed behind the jagged hills of Naroon. Shadows pooled in the broken paths and ancient stone alcoves surrounding the ruined monastery, where Keth Tolaris and Ilarin knelt over the fractured holocron. The shards glowed faintly now, flickering with a pulse that matched neither heart nor machine. "I felt it again," Ilarin whispered, her breath misting in the chilled air. That echo, like a memory caught in the stone. But it wasn't mine. It wasn't even Korriban's. Keth didn't respond immediately. He stared at the darkened sky as if trying to see the ripples in the force the same way one watches waves on water. "I've only heard something like it once," he finally said. "Long ago when I wandered too close to the shattered archives of Malachor. It was the force, but warped, and there was a voice speaking in a tongue I couldn't understand." Ilarin swallowed hard. "The holocron's not just broken, is it? It's infected." Keth nodded. "And something wants it reassembled." They stood, turning toward the crumbling hall at the monastery's heart. It was said the final library of the Ashen Creed had been housed here, a sect of rogue force users who had splintered from both Jedi and Sith alike, centuries before the Clone Wars. They rejected both order and chaos, believing instead that truth only emerged from decay. Their manuscripts were burned, their names erased, and yet this place endured. As they entered the great chamber, the wind howled through shattered stained glass above. Dust lay thick on collapsed scroll racks and bone-dry floor tiles, and at the center, half buried in rubble, stood a dais, its surface carved with strange intersecting symbols, neither Jedi nor Sith. Keth placed one of the holocron shards onto the stone surface. Immediately the air changed. The wind ceased. Time itself seemed to hesitate. Then a whisper filled the chamber. It wasn't a language. It was sensation, hunger, loss. Memory stretched taut and splintered. Ilarin fell to one knee, clutching her head, as a vision spilled into her mind, a figure cloaked in shadow, reaching down into a pit of writhing light. Screams echoed. Some human, others less so. Then, silence again. she gasped, eyes wide. It wants to be whole, but not to teach, to awaken. Keth looked grim. I feared as much. Whatever spirit or consciousness resides within that holocron, it's older than the Republic, older than the Sith. It doesn't want to share knowledge. It wants to be remembered. That's far more dangerous. Suddenly, the force stirred violently. A tremor ran through the floor. Dust fell in thin streams from the stone arches overhead. From the shadows, a figure emerged. It was tall, wrapped in grey cloth that fluttered despite the windless air. Its face was masked, smooth, expressionless metal etched with runes. But its presence was undeniable, cold and unrelenting, like a wound in the force. Keth's hand went to his saber. But the figure raised a single finger, and the blade would not ignite. "You have heard its call," the figure said, its voice layered as if spoken through water and time. "You stand at the edge of forgetting." "Who are you?" Keth demanded. The figure tilted its head. "A keeper, a memory given form, bound here to prevent the rise of the Echoing One." Ilarin's eyes darted to the holocron shard. "Then why let us come this far?" "To show you the cost," it replied. "Others seek the shards, not to awaken, but to merge. They believe the Echoing One can be controlled. They are wrong, but I am bound. I cannot intervene unless summoned." "Then help us stop them," Keth said. "I cannot walk beyond these walls, but I can give you this." The keeper extended its hand. A shimmer in the air coalesced into a glowing glyph, a sigil that pulsed in time with the holocron. As Ilarin stepped forward to take it, she saw through it. Ancient battles, forgotten truths, names carved into stone only to be erased. "You now carry the seal of memory," the keeper intoned. "When the final shard is touched, speak its name, and it will bind the spirit long enough to strike. But beware, the Echoing One was once a Jedi." Silence followed, heavy and uncertain. Then the figure turned and dissolved into dust, caught in a wind that had not blown before. Keth and Ilarin stood alone again, the glyph glowing in her hand, the shard pulsing faintly on the dais. "We're not just trying to stop knowledge from falling into the wrong hands," she whispered. "We're stopping something that's been trying to return for millennia." Keth looked toward the east, where a faint glow suggested the rising sun. "Then we need to find the next shard, before the others do." And with that, they turned and walked out of the ruins, two shadows among many, chasing a myth that did not want to be found. Chapter 16. The Watch in the Walls. The atmosphere inside the Vauclin estate had taken on a density that went beyond the physical. It was as if the walls themselves strained to speak, burdened with secrets and years of silence. Poirot walked slowly along the corridor near the study, his fingertips brushing the wallpaper as though trying to feel a memory embedded in its fabric. Behind him, Hastings followed quietly, scribbling into his notebook more out of habit than necessity. They had spoken little since discovering the contents of the missing will. Leonard's latest testament left everything, house, estate, money, to a charity for blind veterans. Not a sou for family, not even for the devoted nurse Aimee. It was a blow that reshaped the motive map completely. "What now, Poirot?" Hastings finally asked, his voice low. Poirot halted before a tall grandfather clock. Its pendulum swung in heavy arcs, ticking with such regularity it seemed part of the house's heartbeat. "Now, mon ami, we must revisit what we thought we knew. Always the murderer hopes we shall not see what is plainly there." He opened the door to the study again. The room had not changed, but Poirot's eyes searched it as though for the first time. He moved toward the stone fireplace, where Leonard had supposedly collapsed. He stared into the blackened hearth. "The poker," he murmured. "It was placed too neatly after a struggle." "Non, non." Staged. He crouched, eyes narrowing. "Do you hear that?" he asked suddenly. Hastings froze. "No. What?" Poirot pressed his ear against the wall beside the hearth. "A ticking. Subtle. But not the clock's rhythm. Something smaller, nearer." He stood and moved toward the bookcase, then abruptly turned. "This house has been altered. Slightly, but with intent. There is a cavity behind these walls. And if my ears do not deceive me, it contains something mechanical." With Hastings' help, Poirot shifted aside the lower shelf of books and tapped the wall behind. Hollow. "A secret panel," Poirot whispered, "typical of these grand old homes. The question is, who knew about it?" A firm press on the panel's molding caused it to spring open, revealing a dark, narrow cavity not much wider than a shoebox. Inside sat an old wooden box, wrapped in faded linen. Poirot lifted it out with care and opened it. Inside lay a small antique pocket watch, its ticking sharp, rhythmic, and out of place among the dust. Alongside it rested a slim journal. Poirot's fingers lingered on the cover before opening the book. August 12th, he knows. I saw it in his eyes. Lucien is too clever to confront me yet, but I can feel the pressure mounting. I never should have returned to this cursed house. I never should have trusted Nurse Aimée with a copy of the first will. But I was afraid. Afraid they would find out what I did during the war. Afraid the truth would swallow me alive. Poirot glanced up. "You see, Hastings, it was never merely about inheritance. But this, what does it mean? Who wrote it?" Poirot pointed to the corner of the first page, where a familiar flourish signed the name, Léonard Vauquelin. Hastings blinked. He was hiding something. Oui, and more importantly, he was afraid of something or someone, and the clue he left us is this. Nurse Aimée had the copy of the first will. Then, Poirot snapped the journal shut. "She lied. She told us she did not know the contents. But if this is true, then she knew Leonard changed his will again, and that changes everything." Their steps were brisk as they returned to the drawing room, where Aimée was seated quietly, knitting in the corner. She looked up with the same warm expression that had first won Poirot's trust. "Nurse Aimée," he began, "do forgive the intrusion, but I must ask you again. Did you ever see a second will? The one dated 3 weeks before Monsieur Vauquelin's death?" Her needles paused mid-stitch. "I told you before, Monsieur Poirot, I didn't. And yet, in his own journal, he states that he entrusted you with it." A shadow passed over her face. Perhaps I misunderstood. He asked me to look after a sealed envelope, but he never said what was inside." Poirot tilted his head. "And what did you do with it?" I put it in the desk in his bedroom. It vanished a few days before he died." "A convenient disappearance," Hastings muttered. Aimée's expression hardened. "You think I took it? Burned it? Hid it?" "I think someone did," Poirot replied evenly. "And it would require access. Trust and fear of what that document contained." A silence stretched between them. Finally, Aimée exhaled. "He didn't want to leave anything to the family. He said they didn't deserve it. Said he owed something greater to the men who came back blind, broken. He wept when he signed it." Poirot nodded slowly. "So you did know?" "I didn't think it would be relevant. Not until now." Poirot turned to Hastings. "Mon ami, we must find that envelope. Whether it exists still or was destroyed. Either way, the answer lies with it. But if Aimée didn't take it, then someone else did. And that someone knew it meant losing everything, which gives them the strongest motive of all." From the shadows outside the drawing room, a figure watched them, eyes wide, breath held, and a thought formed like smoke in their mind. "They're getting close." Poirot turned back to Aimée. "Merci, mademoiselle. You've helped more than you know." As he and Hastings exited the room, Poirot murmured, The pieces are shifting, Hastings. The real picture is beginning to show, and very soon the murderer will have no place left to hide. Chapter 17. The Broken Thread. The cab ride back to the Hôtel de la Paix was uneventful, but Hercule Poirot's mind was ablaze with tension. He sat still, fingers laced on his lap, rocking gently with the motion of the vehicle. Hastings, seated beside him, noticed the way Poirot's eyes narrowed as if the great mind within him was tugging at a thread that resisted being drawn forth. "It's unraveling, Hastings," Poirot said quietly. "But the thread is old, and it keeps breaking before I can see the full tapestry." "You mean the will?" Hastings asked. "The will is part of it, yes. But no, this is older than that. Older than Madame Fournier's illness, older than Martine's frightened glances. There is something—" Poirot pressed his fingertips together. Something from years ago, buried beneath polite smiles and fine manners. When they arrived, the lobby was nearly empty, save for a uniformed porter asleep behind the desk. Poirot took the stairs two at a time, a surprising burst of energy for the little Belgian, and reached their room before Hastings could catch up. Once inside, Poirot unlocked his leather valise and pulled out a bundle of notes he'd written over the past few days. He began laying them out on the table in a precise pattern. Hastings watched in silence, unsure whether to interrupt. Finally, Poirot tapped a note with his finger. The candles. Candles. In the corridor outside Madame Fournier's room. Martine mentioned the staff were ordered to use them at night after her illness began. Something about sensitivity to electric light. Yes, I remember. Poirot looked up sharply. And yet on the night of the incident, the maid swore she had just lit the candle. But it had already burned down a third. Hastings frowned. So someone had relit it? Non, mon ami. Someone had swapped it. He stood up and began pacing. Candles are easy to manipulate. A candle already burned can give the illusion that time has passed. It creates confusion. It suggests, wrongly, that someone left earlier or stayed longer. You think it was used to create a false timeline? Poirot nodded slowly. But why? And by whom? He moved to the window and pulled back the heavy curtain, peering into the misty Parisian night. A solitary gas lamp flickered in the courtyard, throwing dancing shadows along the hotel's cobbled entrance. Poirot's eyes lingered on the silhouette of a man pacing below. Tall, nervous, coat collar up. Poirot turned abruptly. "Come, Hastings." At this hour? Poirot was already at the door. "Yes. I wish to speak to our American friend, Mr. Burton, once more. I do not think he has been entirely honest with us." They made their way down to the lobby where the man Poirot had seen. Burton was just about to step out through the revolving door. "Mr. Burton," Poirot called. The man stopped, startled. "Oh, Detective Poirot. Out for fresh air?" Poirot asked with a smile, stepping closer. Burton nodded stiffly. "Just clearing my head. The whole business has been getting to me." "I understand. Death has a way of shaking the nerves. Might I ask you something?" "A small detail, merely to clarify my thoughts." Burton hesitated. "If I can help." Poirot steepled his fingers. "You said you were in the salon the night Madame Fournier died. Reading?" "Yes. And no one else came in?" "No." Poirot gave a slight tilt of the head. "And yet the maid swore someone came down the staircase at 11:15, a tall man with a limp." Burton's jaw tightened, just barely. "I find it curious," Poirot continued, "because no one fits that description. No guest registered as such. No staff reported injured. And you, Mr. Burton, you limp when tired, do you not?" Burton's face flushed. "An old injury, nothing more." "An old injury? From the war?" Burton nodded. "Gas attack at Cambrai." Poirot's eyes darkened. "And were you there alone?" Burton blinked. "What?" "At Cambrai. Were you alone when you were injured?" There was a pause, long enough for Hastings to catch the shift in the air. Burton's jaw twitched. "No," he said. "There was someone else." Poirot pressed. "A Frenchman?" Another pause. Then, "Yes. How did you—" Poirot raised a hand gently. "Mademoiselle Martine's father served in Cambrai. He died in 1917, or so she believed." Burton's eyes widened. "I think you knew him. I think you knew he didn't die, that he deserted, or worse. And I think Madame Fournier discovered this when she began looking through her late husband's correspondence. You, Mr. Burton, had every reason to stop her before that truth became public." "I didn't," Burton began, but Poirot silenced him with a sharp look. "I do not say you killed her, not yet, but I believe your past ties to this family go deeper than you've admitted. The war is over, Mr. Burton, but its ghosts have not been laid to rest." Burton looked shaken but said nothing more. Poirot turned to Hastings. "We are getting close," he murmured. "Too close, perhaps. And now we must act with great care. Someone is watching us, mon ami, and they are afraid." Chapter 18. The Final Glove. The drawing-room of Lady Mortham's estate had fallen still, every face marked by tension and expectancy. Poirot stood, hands neatly folded behind his back, the firelight casting sharp shadows across the carpet as though mirroring the tangled web of deceit he had so delicately unraveled. He began softly, "There is one truth in murder, mes amis. It is never as clean as the killer believes it to be." Lady Mortham sat pale and rigid in her chair, her handkerchief crumpled in her lap. Inspector Hartridge leaned forward from his position near the window, while Miss Evangeline and the remaining household staff stood by, tight-lipped and alert. Everyone had been summoned for this final confrontation. Poirot turned his gaze to Evangeline. "You believed yourself quite clever," he said. "Rewriting Miss Lavinia's will, suppressing letters, deceiving Lady Mortham, all for a fortune." Evangeline's lips tightened, but she remained silent. Poirot continued, "But it was not you who committed the murder." A shocked murmur rippled across the room. Hartridge frowned. "But you said—" Poirot raised a hand. "Patience, mon ami. There were two conspiracies, one of deception and one of death." He turned slowly toward the figure hunched near the sideboard. Alfred, the valet. The man's eyes darted nervously. "Yes, monsieur," Poirot said gently. "It was you who struck Miss Lavinia in the night. You who placed the broken candlestick near her, wiped away the blood, and staged the scene to look accidental." Alfred staggered back. I don't know what you mean." Poirot stepped forward. "The letter opener, bearing your fingerprints. The thread of blue wool from your uniform caught on her dressing table, and the final clue, the faint print of a glove smeared with lavender oil." Poirot produced the glove from his pocket. "You disposed of it in the furnace, but the second one remained hidden, tucked beneath the cushion of Miss Lavinia's reading chair. Not enough ash to destroy the scent. And lavender oil, you see, is quite persistent." Hartridge's face lit with recognition. "And only the valet used that specific oil to clean the silver." "Exactement," Poirot said. Alfred's shoulders slumped. "She was going to ruin everything. She'd found out about my past. The theft in Hampshire. I thought it was buried." Poirot nodded gravely. "And so, fearing discovery, you silenced her. A panicked act, one made with poor foresight. But murder, monsieur, always leaves a trail, even when gloves are worn." Lady Mortham let out a gasp, her composure cracking. "But what about Evangeline?" Hartridge asked, gesturing to the secretary. Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Miss Evangeline is guilty of greed and manipulation, yes, but not murder. She forged the will after Miss Lavinia's death, hoping to divert the inheritance. That too is a crime, but a separate one." Poirot turned to Evangeline. "You hoped to delay the discovery of the body, to buy yourself time, but it was your desperation to control the narrative that drew suspicion." Evangeline stared at the carpet, lips trembling. Poirot clasped his hands. You both acted under the belief that Miss Lavinia's eccentricities gave you cover, but in truth, it was her sharp eye and discipline that left behind the details which undid you. He stepped back as Hartridge moved to arrest both Alfred and Evangeline. The tension shattered like glass. Lady Mortham exhaled heavily, as if releasing years of secrets. Poirot turned to her gently. I regret that it ends in such sorrow, madame, but justice, n'est-ce pas, must always be restored. Lady Mortham gave a weak nod. She was difficult, but she did not deserve this. Poirot bowed slightly. No one ever does. As Hartridge led the culprits away, Poirot glanced once more at the fire. The mystery had unraveled itself like the hem of a fraying tapestry, revealing, beneath all its elegance, the brutal hand that had pulled the thread. He turned to Hastings, who had stood silent throughout, wide-eyed. Well, my friend, Poirot said quietly, once again, the little grey cells prevail. And with that, they stepped out into the foggy evening, where the secrets of Mortham Manor would linger only in shadow and in memory.